Okay, welcome everyone to the Marx Memorial Library. This is the third in our series of lectures on communist educators, so individuals who played a leading role in developing the Marx Memorial Library as a workers' school. This evening we're looking at Andrew Rothstein. Very appropriately we've got Professor John Foster here, who now plays a very leading role in our education work here at MML, and he's going to talk a bit about Andrew.
Well, I hope there's a number of people here who remember Andrew Rothstein. I'm sure there are. Well, the screen up there says Andrew Rothstein, communist educator, and then it has some words. They're actually written by Andrew Rothstein, but not about himself. But I think they capture what Andrew Rothstein was. Unshakable devotion to principle, diamond-hard resolution in defending it, exceptional personal modesty, born of a desire to explain and persuade, not to browbeat, the embodiment of the finest qualities of a Marxist and a teacher. I'll come back to who he said it about later, but start with a little about his life in general, and then three aspects of his life as an educator. As a defender of Marxism in practical politics, as a historian of Britain as an imperialist power, and most crucially of all, as the key explainer in Britain of the significance of the Russian Revolution and subsequently of the role of the USSR. He was the key person through 50, 60, 70 years. So start with a little about Andrew Rothstein himself. He was born here in Islington in 1898. He attended the Owen School. He got a scholarship to Balliol. In 1917 he was called up and did military service for a year and a half. He returned to Balliol in 1918 to 1920. He was in 1920 a foundation member of the new Communist Party of Britain. Previously had been a member of the British Socialist Party, and a little bit more than just a founder member. He was, from September 1920, the key figure within the hands-off Russia Committee, taking over from his father, Theodore. He was the press secretary of the Russian trade delegation from December 1920, London correspondent of Roster, and that's a Roster propaganda poster by Mayakovsky up on the right-hand side of the screen there. He was chief correspondent to the London office of TASS from 24 to 36, a Soviet part of the Soviet delegation to the League of Nations, 36 to 38, president of the Foreign Press Association in London, 1943 to 45, a lecturer in Soviet history at the London University, 1946 to 50, when he was, I think, probably the only person who was actually sacked for being a communist. A lot of other academics suffered other problems in their promotion and getting jobs, but he was the only one who was sacked on the basis that he, being a communist, could not teach objectively. And he was chair of Marx Memorial Library from 1945 to 1970 and president up to 1986 when he retired. I'll remember to press the thing this time. Here we are. So, diamond hard, that's the first thing I want to stress about Andrew. When he was just turned 20, he led probably the first mutiny in the British Army against being sent to Russia. He was a corporal. He'd served in the army for about a year. He heard that the regiment was going to be asked to volunteer. This was at the beginning of December 1918, before the main mutinies began. and he decided to get up on a table in the canteen and talk to the other squaddies and try and win them to refuse to volunteer. And that he did. And he got up, and being a Balliol scholar, he said, "What you're facing here is a people's revolution. It was like what happened in Britain in 1640 to 1649, when working people rose up against Charles I and the monarchy and established a republic. Are you going to stop the Soviets and the Soviet Russian people from doing the same and taking their country forward on a new path of socialism?" And amazingly, he got support. And the following day, when they were asked to parade, only one person stood forward to go to Russia. That wasn't the end of it, because that was a volunteering. At the beginning of January, they were all summoned back to, in fact, it was Christmas Day, I think. They were all summoned back to camp, and they were told it would be compulsory to embark for Russia. And on this occasion, he did a good bit more organizing beforehand, and the entire unit refused. And at that time, there were, and it was out on the Salisbury Plain, mutinies going on everywhere, and the officers in command just gave up. And it was one of a series of mutinies. But that took some courage for a 20-year-old Balliol scholar. The second example of being diamond hard was at Oxford, where he was identified by the MI5 in 1920. It's on his file in the Public Record Office as the leader of the communists at Oxford, an extremely active propagandist of intellectual Bolshevism. And it was a result of that identification, and probably other things, that Lord Curzon, the Foreign Secretary, intervened with the authorities at Balliol College and ensured that his career at Oxford was terminated at that point in summer 1920. He had plenty of other things to do in summer 2020, so I doubt whether it greatly displeased him, but nonetheless it showed that already he had made his mark and was extremely courageous in his defiance of the university authorities. The third was when in 1928 he led a majority of the executive of the British Communist Party to defy the Communist International, when it was calling on the British Communist Party to adopt a new class against class line that would demand that the party broke off all relationships with the Labour Party, denounced it as an entirely irredeemable right-wing party, break the link that had existed up to the point of 1928.
The adoption of the new line policy, which treated the Labour Party as a social fascist party, which treated the trade unions as being part of the structure of the capitalist state, seemed to me, and I'm all the more convinced of it now, as a complete misjudgment of the international situation and the situation in Britain.
And that wasn't the only example of his defiance, which wasn't an easy thing to do in those days, of the Communist International. He certainly did intervene on behalf of some of those who were purged in the 1930s at great personal risk when he was in Moscow. So he was diamond hard in terms of standing up for the things that he thought he ought to stand up for. But I want to concentrate on him as an educator. First, as a defender of Marxism in practical politics, and how he thought that you should develop an understanding of Marxism within the practical politics of Britain. Secondly, as a historian, And thirdly, and most crucially, his role as an explainer in Britain of the significance of the Russian Revolution and the USSR. So, to start with practical politics. Andrew had a heritage that he carried forward. And the heritage came from his father and his father's associates. His father was Theodor Rothstein, who came to this country in 1890, I think it was. He was, from 1895, a member of the British, or the Social Democratic Party, Social Democratic Federation, what became the British Socialist Party in 1910, I think. And Theodor Rothstein was a refugee from political persecution in Russia. He was in the same political stream as Lenin, and when the Russian Social Democrats split, he was associated throughout the rest of his life with Lenin. Theodor was the figure who organized Lenin's visits to this country, particularly between 1902 and 1903, when in this building, and this building probably is full of ghosts, Theodor and Lenin helped lay out the script, the print for Iskra, which was then taken elsewhere to a printing press in the East End of London for printing. And they did that for about a year and a quarter in a small room that was more or less on the east wing, I think, of this building. So Theodor did that. He also organized at least one conference of the Russian Social Democratic Party, the Lenin group within it, in London. And he maintained a constant liaison with Lenin right up till he left this country in 1920 and was deprived of his passport and was never able to return. He became a leading Soviet diplomat, first as an ambassador to Persia, as it was called then, and then elsewhere within the operations of the Communist International. So that was Andrew Rothstein's father, Theodor. So he had that international link, he had the link with Lenin. But his most important role was within British politics, within the Social Democratic Federation, and in fighting for, you could say it's, in hindsight, a Leninist position, but it was a position that sought to maintain that party as a Marxist party of class struggle, rooted in the working class and linked to the organized labor movement. He opposed Heineman's attempts to break the links with the trade union movement. Heinemann always had a contempt for the reformist trade unions. Theodor said, this is wrong. The trade unions must be worked with, and you must try and change their opinions from inside. You can't do it any other way. He opposed Heinemann's chauvinism, was the leading figure in the period 1900 to 1902, when Heinemann was taking a chauvinist position on the Boer War and also an anti-Semitic position. Heinemann fought him on that, but most crucially, he fought him right the way through the First World War, when Heinemann wanted to, and did for a period, lead the what was then the British Socialist Party into a divided support for the war. Many members refused to follow Heinemann, but Heinemann took that position. But by 1916, in alliance with Inkpin and Gallagher and Maclean, Johnny Campbell and others, he succeeded in defeating Heinemann and taking the British Socialist Party to an anti-war position. Heinemann continued to keep control of justice, but the new liberated British Socialist Party, following a Leninist position, published the call. At that point in 1916, they lost control of this building, which was the 20th Century Press. So it passed out, in a sense, of the mainstream and continued with Heinemann until Heinemann's outfit, I think, went bust about 1922. But that, apart from that slight slur on this building during that period, this building has been in good hands right the way through, more or less, constantly. Anyway, that was Andrew's heritage. And as you can see, he did not bear that heritage lightly. In terms of his own interventions in the army, at Balliol, he carried forward those politics himself. And when in August 1920, it may have even been July, I think, Theodore went off to Russia and then could not get back, and he wanted to get back, because he wanted to lead the work of the Soviet trade/press delegation. There was no embassy. The British government was actually physically at war with the Bolsheviks in Russia. Andrew took over more or less all the roles that his father had previously undertaken, and particularly in terms of the press work that was being done and the Hands-Off Russia Committee. So he took all that work over. That was his introduction to politics. Now, he also played, he wasn't just a founder member of the British Communist Party. This was the leading article on the front page of The Communist on the 12th of August, 1920. The Communist Party was formed at a conference in, I think, 1st and 2nd of August, 1920. I think this would have been the second main front page article in the renamed call. It now was called The Communists from the beginning of August, written by somebody called C.M. Roebuck. That was one of Rothstein's many nom de plumes. That was Rothstein, Andrew Rothstein. And you probably can't read that. You might be able to. Yep, I don't know. But it underlines what Rothstein at the time and his fellow communists saw, not as a revolutionary situation, but as a situation that had revolutionary potential. Writing later in the 1920s, Rothstein said the level of mobilization in 1920 was higher than that during the general strike in the period immediately after. And it was for a number of particular reasons. The crisis emerged, and that's the picture of Harry Pollitt, because he was a key figure within it, a key figure within the formation of the new Communist Party, a key figure within the British Socialist Party. Harry Pollitt leading the Jolly George dock strike that occurred in July. This was when the dockers refused to continue loading the Jolly George. It wasn't just containing rifles. What was being loaded onto that ship was planes, bombers that were going to be shipped out to Poland as part of its great arsenal to attack the Soviet Union. And that spread into a major revolt that was led by the Joint Committee of the Labour Party and the TUC that called a general strike if the government did not terminate its preparations for war, for renewing and a second, third wave of the war against the Soviet, or the young Soviet Republic that had been going on since December 1918, or before in fact. Now, that was a remarkable occurrence. It's difficult to think of the TUC and the Labour Party calling a general strike at any time. It only did once again, and that was in 1926. But it did so in 1920 because of the scale of rank-and-file mobilization that occurred during the First World War, a mass shop stewards movement, strikes that had occurred in January 1919 in Scotland for a shorter working week, but demanding government intervention basically to provide work for the unemployed, that also spread to Belfast, to London, South Wales, and parts of Lancashire. Near enough a general strike, a high level of mobilization, which was carried forward into the threat of a general strike when they started to try and take back into private ownership the coal industry in February 1919, and which through the rest of that year saw a series of threatened and actual strikes which maintained the level of militancy and intensified it, and saw a swing to the left in almost all the major unions. So that in early summer 1920, the majority of the members of it wasn't the General Council of the TUC at that time, it was the executive, were in fact on the left, pro-Soviet, and were also, because the organization of the TUC and the Labour Party at that time was fused together, were also the dominant force within the Labour Party. And where the Daily Herald, which had a circulation at that time of over 200,000, was in the hands of Robert Williams, who was a communist, and Lansbury, who was very closely associated with with Rothstein and those in the British Socialist Party who were opposing Russia. That's why the government saw it as so dangerous, because the organized trade union and labour movement were threatening a general strike to change its policy, and where they had mass backing. And you can see what he wrote here. We are witnessing the culmination, the triumphant climax of socialist, it should be socialist Russia, that's a mistake in my transcription, socialist Russia's struggle for life. We are spectators of the first storms and menacing flashes which mark the beginnings of Western labour's revolt in Britain. These processes, logically consecutive, are not so sharply divided in reality. They are interwoven and inextricably fused. This is the meaning of the events of the past fortnight. Concretely, these are the last attempts of the capitalists to crush the new order in Russia, knowing full well that if it is established, their own turn was bound to come. Today that time has arrived. And by that last attempt to crush Soviet Russia, they have only helped to muster the very rally of the working class which they feared. Because when it was clear the government was set on a new war, and it was likely to involve a new conscription, popular anger became absolutely massive. In the first weeks of August, this is the time when the Communist Party was being formed, there were mass demonstrations as well as the setting up of local action committees. The government tried to combat it. It was a quite different response to what happened during the First World War. The government, by and large, most of the time had things in its hand in the First World War. It sent out lecturers to give pro-war lectures. They were managing fine. And those who opposed the war were, certainly in the first 2 or 3 years, usually grabbed hold of and mishandled. On this occasion, according to the government's own reports, the lecturers and the people they set out on platforms to defend the government's policies were thrown off their platforms, were chased, and mass demonstrations were against the war because people were absolutely sick and tired of the war. They weren't necessarily pro-Soviet, but they were sick and tired of the war. They would not contemplate a re-emergence of conscription. And that is what Rothstein is talking about there. And that was also why, at that particular point, those in the British Socialist Party saw it as so important to get unity with the other elements on the left who felt similarly to themselves, those on the left of the ILP and those in the Socialist Labour Party, who was the main party that organised the shop stewards, people who had led largely that movement in Scotland in particular. So that was what that was trying to do at that particular point. That's why that moment was a key moment in the formation, and that was the point at which very important discussions took place within the Communist Party, the key debate in the First Congress in August 1920, in which Rothstein took part, and in which Theodor Rothstein took part also from a distance, because he was one of those who briefed Lenin as he was having debates in Moscow at the same time over the issue of whether or not the Communist Party should seek affiliation to the Labour Party, as the British Socialist Party had been as an affiliate right up till July 1920, and whether it should participate in parliamentary elections and whether it should support the Labour Party or not in those elections. And of course, at that point, most communists were individual members of the Labour Party, either through their trade unions or trades and labour councils or as individual members. So that was the big debate. And Rothstein took a major part in that debate. He argued against the sectarians, as he called them, and the anarcho-syndicalists who said, we don't want to have anything to do with parliamentary affairs. It should be workers' councils. We should not be involved in elections. We should work to establish workers' councils on the ground, on the basis of what we'd already achieved during the First World War and the period immediately after. And it was a perfectly valid argument. Gallagher took that position. Gallagher had probably more experience than anybody else as a working class organiser and had in fact himself developed workers' councils in locality terms during the 1919 general strike in Scotland. He was, I think, secretary of the organising committee, and he'd been instrumental in setting these up. So they organised neighbourhoods, and he saw them, and he wrote a pamphlet subsequently, saw them as, in a sense, Soviets that were in development. So that was his argument. Most people here probably are aware of Lenin, left-wing communism, where he put the counter-position, and it was also the counter-position that Rothstein put. And the argument, and I probably don't want to do this at great length because you probably all sitting here know it better than me, the arguments, they were that the British Labour Party was different from social democratic parties. It was organically based in the trade union movement. It had been established by the trade union movement. It remained based within it. The TUC was the key body that dominated it. And over the previous 3 months, they could have already seen what a left-wing majority could do in terms of changing the policies of the Labour Party and getting the Labour Party itself to support a general strike. But it was more profound in a sense than that. Most working people in Britain were not Bolsheviks. Most weren't even at that stage socialist in any doctrinal form. quite a lot would be, inside the trade union movement, would be liberals. A lot of the mining MPs had remained liberal MPs, I think, right up till 1910. So you had that major tradition. But he said, working people have created the trade unions and they have created the Labour Party. They have also, only very recently, won the vote, because of course Britain was the last country to get universal suffrage, and it only got it partially even in 1918. Property suffrage still continued until 1946, I think, wasn't it? So they had won it to a large degree by 1918. And also drew on Lenin, because the Bolsheviks, of course, themselves had exploited the parliamentary system in Russia. But, said Rothstein, you, and very much Lenin and left-wing communism, you have to work within these institutions patiently to explain, to be able to develop that understanding of the nature of the capitalist state. And you will do that only if you are there talking to people. And it was that position that won the day in 1920. So that is Rothstein and his beginning as a practical politician. I think that probably takes us on to the next slide, and I'll have to hurry up because I'm going slowly. The next was this period in 1928. We won't do a history of the period from 1920 to 1928, except to say that it was a period of in which initially in 1920 the government massively deflated the economy, created mass unemployment with a deliberate political intent of destroying rank and file shop steward mobilization and placing the control of the trade union movement back into the hands of the right-wing leadership. Done quite deliberately, quite explicitly for that purpose. And that did mean that it showed Rothstein was quite right, because had everything been put onto shop stewards and workers' committees, the whole of that disappeared, more or less. The unemployed workers' movement took its place in 1921, 22, and expanded, and there was mass struggles of various kinds. But the key battle then went on within inside the Labour Party and the trade union, between left and right, culminating in the general strike of 1926, when again the strength of the left did manage to commit the General Council of the TUC to a general strike, but which they betrayed. It was in the aftermath of that, in 1926, 27 and 28, that not just people in the Communist International, as a result of things that have been happening in Germany and France and Italy, but people inside the British Party started to argue that we needed a new political line in this country, and more generally, that of actually frontally opposing the Labour Party, and not just the Labour Party, all existing trade unions. All were in the hands of the right wing. And they needed to be denounced within a class against class policy. Rothstein, along with Johnny Campbell, and a majority on the executive, although I suspect that Rothstein and Johnny Campbell and Gallagher and Pollitt had a considerable hand in the general argumentation, but it was the resolution was in the name of Rothstein and Johnny Campbell, argued that this new line that had come from the Comintern, and the person who relayed it was Palm Dutt, was basically wrong, and argued that despite everything that had happened, the Labour Party was not yet a social democratic party. despite its putrefied leadership, it's a nice word, that probably came from Andrew, I don't know, and its social democratic program and its attempts to impose social democratic discipline by expelling communists. But the trade unions still had a numerical preponderance, and standing in direct confrontation with the Labour Party would prevent the Communist Party working inside it in the way that Andrew always said had to be the case. You had to be inside these organizations in order to persuade. To stand outside, to simply grandstand and say you are the class enemy, was not going to change anybody's mind. He had the support at that time. By 1928-29, end of it, 28 into 29, that policy was in fact imposed, and Rothstein, I think, was out of the executive by 1929. And it was a fairly disastrous position for the Communist Party. The Communist Party saw its membership double during the period of the general strike, up to, I think it was 11,000 by late 1926, and it had fallen right back to about 2,000 by 1930. That wasn't to say that period didn't have some achievements, it did, particularly in terms of setting up a daily newspaper, but nonetheless, the sundering of those links with the trade union movement, of working inside the trade union movement, were a major setback, and that position was only recaptured gradually in 1932, 33, and 34, when, of course, the Comintern, in response to the rise of fascism, changed its own position in general, and undoubtedly the influence in Britain was important. So that's Andrew in 1928. And this is Andrew in 1985 to 1988, opposing revisionism, when he was in his almost 90. He was 90 in 1988. But that didn't stop Andrew, along with an earlier figure in this series, Paige Arnott, from writing articles in the American magazine, Political Affairs, and in the Morning Star, and in the Communist Campaign Review, in which he denounced the departure from Marxism by the then revisionist leadership of the CPGB. There are a series of quite remarkable articles in which he again argues that the position taken from the late 1970s by a clique around the journal Marxism Today, and which by the early 80s had become the dominant group within the executive, narrowly winning a vote in the political committee in 1981. In fact, it was a 6-6, I think, and one person walked out and then they got the majority. But anyway, by certainly 1984 and 5, they were fully dominant and were expelling whole districts of the party that resisted them, like the London district. The Northwest were expelled, others were isolated, like I think, West Middlesex and East Midlands, and many people were expelled. Andrew Rothstein spoke out. They didn't dare expel him, because that would have been, I think, just a little bit more than even Gordon MacLennan, at the time General Secretary, could bring himself to do, nor did they try and expel Andrew Rothstein. But they could have been expelled. I don't think that would have worried Andrew Rothstein very much. He wrote me a very nice letter when I was expelled and said I'd done the best possible thing that I could have done to get expelled. But he wrote these very, very pungent articles which said that to say that the working class, which is what Marxism Today said, had, in a sense, disappeared as an agent of political change to socialism was to completely misunderstand Marxism. And of course, I think subsequently, he has been shown to be quite correct. To distance the Communist Party from the organized trade union and labour movement and the Labour Party was a fundamental mistake. You had to understand how the working class had changed and understand how you were going to be able to work within a working class that had not just changed but actually got bigger when you understood it in full Marxist terms. I remember talking to him in those days, and he read diligently the copies of Marxism Today as it came out, and I don't know whether you remember Marxism Today. As in those days, it had very, very shiny covers. It was very, very lavishly produced with funds from some source I never discovered about, even though I was on the editorial board until I was expelled. And he remarked, when he'd been doing this, he always felt that at the end of a session of reading these copies of Marxism Today, he had to go and wash his hands, because they had the kind of lubricious feel of some kind of pornographic magazine in his mind. That was his comments on Marxism Today in those days. Anyway, again, you can see, I think, a coherent logic of thinking going from 1920 through 1928, right up to 1985 to 1988, of understanding the need to work within the organizations of working people that were trusted and to be able to explain patiently within them. Let's go on. Now, I'll run over this very quickly. An educator as a historian. He wrote a great deal. If you look in the, probably you look in the catalogue for Marx Memorial Library, you'll find lots and lots of references to Andrew Rothstein, translating works, editing works from Russia, but also writing short works, writing long works, writing works of polemic, and writing history books. I only mention, I think, how many? Five, but they are all important, and he saw them as important. They were, I'm afraid, to some extent ignored in their time, apart from people on the left, but you can learn a great deal from them. Peter the Great and Marlborough. Well, you might say he wrote a book about Peter the Great and Marlborough because he was bilingual in Russian and English, but it wasn't really the reason. He wanted to expose the roots of British capitalist foreign policy. And that war, the War of Spanish Succession, that involved Russia, Prussia, France, the Netherlands in alliance with Britain, and Marlborough as the great general. He wanted to use that as an illustration of how the British concept, anchored in its status as the world's first capitalist power, the concept of the balance of power came about. And it hinges around the liaison between Marlborough and Peter the Great, in which Marlborough and the British maneuvered the Prussians and the Swedes into a mutually destructive conflict for the benefit of Britain, which was at that time joint with Holland, the other, or Netherlands, the other capitalist power at the time, which enabled Britain to win that war with a minimum commitment of forces, using other people's armies, using mercenaries, establishing a balance of power by getting other people to fight each other, and particularly to fight the French, that enabled Britain to capture key world trade routes and trading posts in the Mediterranean, around Africa and elsewhere. And the doctrine of the balance of power remained the basis of Britain's policy as a capitalist power through the 18th and 19th centuries, the founding doctrine of the Foreign Office, and of course during the 20th century as well. So that was his first book, and anybody who is interested in the origins of British capitalist, the first capitalist power, should read that book. The Munich conspiracy, in a sense, follows on. Peter the Great Marlborough was based on not just an analysis of other people's books, it was based on Rothstein going into the National Record Office and getting all the records, and also having access to the Russian records. The Munich conspiracy, which I think was written in 1960s, was based on first access to Foreign Office documents from 1936, 37, 38, 39. And also, obviously, access to the Soviet counterparts and some of the German. And he was, for the first time, able to expose what was going on in the background to Munich. It wasn't, of course, as it was portrayed at the time, a bid by Chamberlain to win the peace by making a few concessions. It wasn't about avoiding war. It was, in fact, about entering into diplomatic commitments with Germany, explicitly written down, that they would have a free hand to move to the east against the Soviet Union. Negotiated also with the French and other powers in Europe. That's what it was really about. So it wasn't about peace. It was about maintaining a balance of power with Britain at the center by turning Germany east actively and saying that they would have British support in doing so. Not just Czechoslovakia, not just the immediate target. British foreign policy and its critics. This was looking at some of those three people that he had actually worked with in terms of combating Britain's foreign policy. William Scowen Blunt, who died in 1920, but who he knew, who was an old school diplomat, but who was disgusted by the character of British rule in India and became an implacable opponent of British rule in India. He wasn't a socialist, but he opposed Britain's imperial role there and elsewhere, and supported the Indian liberation movement. So he was showing that there were people within the British Foreign Service who took a good position in the end. E.D. Morel was the person who, not a diplomat, but a polemicist, a journalist, who exposed some of the scandals in the Congo and Belgian Congo, but whose major role was setting up the Union of Democratic Control during the First World War and exposing imperialist war aims. Again, he worked closely with Rothstein in the 1920 to 30 period. Again, not a socialist, but somebody with whom he worked closely. And again, Robert Dell, another key polemicist and journalist, anti-fascist, opposing Britain's appeasement of Germany and what it was really about. So again, that is him talking about people who, from inside the establishment, stood up and opposed Britain's policies. And finally, no, I think that's me go. No, finally, when Britain invaded Soviet Russia, again, this was once the documentary evidence had come out. He went into it and looked. He was the first one, I think, who did so. There have been a lot of historians, as I'll mention later. I won't go on much longer. Who looked at the British invasion of Russia that started in March 1918. You could have thought Britain was rather occupied in a war with Germany at the time in March 1918, but no, it was sending expeditionary troops to occupy the northern peninsula in Russia, which gave it easy access down, it was thought, to St. Petersburg, and which ultimately became the basis of a absolutely massive military operation, not just through North Russia, but from the Pacific and from the Black Sea. We'll say a little bit about that later. Not too much later, because I know I've been going on too long already. But finally, and I am getting there finally, Rothstein as an educator, as a journalist. And I suppose journalists are basically educators. We generally see journalists as on the left as a bloody nuisance, as a people who promote the ideas of the ruling class. But there is a tradition of socialist journalism, and I hope that the Morning Star and the Daily Worker have been exponents of it for over 90 years now. And Andrew Rothstein, for most of his life, worked as a journalist to explain the nature of Soviet Russia and what it meant to working people. He was the key person. Virtually nothing that went out into the press didn't come through the hands of Andrew Rothstein. Andrew was the one who would translate everything on a daily basis into English, would look at it politically and think, what is the best way of presenting this to an English, to a British audience? That's what he did, day in, day out, between 1920, when he took over his father's role, and 1966, more or less, he gave up that role and formally retired. Now, he was only the transmitter, as in a sense, of messages that came from elsewhere, but in doing so, that message, if well relayed, did help transform assumptions and transform British politics about the nature of the working class as a leading class, about the possibility of a non-capitalist society and capitalism not being inevitable. We probably do not sufficiently kind of realize or estimate the importance of that knowledge within the British trade union movement, even though at no time in its history, apart maybe from a brief period in 1943-44, did people identify directly in a positive way with the Soviet Union. It's always a minor position of direct identification. But the knowledge that another society could be established that was socialist, not capitalist, could construct a society that was viable, could actually defeat the Nazis in war, was something that had an impact even on people who were on the right wing of the Labour Party, like Bevin became and others. They all saw that as something that changed their assumptions. And it was Bevin who, it was Rothstein who was the person who did this. I don't kind of want to, I don't think there is time to go through it in detail. But just to take one particular thing that he did put together, it's difficult in a sense to measure the success of a journalist, because he is simply the transmitter of something that is a reality elsewhere. You could say, was it to do, could you measure it by the concern of the British government? Well, the British government was always intensely concerned about the Soviet Union, but although they were annoyed about Andrew Rothstein and kept all kinds of massive numbers of MI5 files about him and what he was doing and where he was and all the rest of it, volumes of them in the Public Record Office, it wasn't Andrew they were worried about, it was the Soviet Union that they were worried about. And they had programs that went through from the 1920s right through to the 1960s and even 70s that were meant to, in terms of counter-propaganda, to oppose that understanding that they thought was gaining ground in the labour movement. And you couldn't even do it by the scale of pro-Soviet opinion, because that really did depend on what the Soviet Union was doing at different times. But what you could, I think, measure Andrew's achievement by was the clarity and accuracy of his explanation. And I think an example would be his History of the USSR. Probably not many people know that book now. Published in 1950, I think it was the year that he was thrown out of London University for not being objective, in which he explained the nature of the Soviet Union and how it had come into being and how it had developed. And if you go through it today, and if you read the research that has been done since academically, you will find almost everything is validated. He talked about the social base of the Bolsheviks and why they were different from the Mensheviks. Now, David Lane's study of the origins of Russian Bolshevism show that he was quite right. The Bolsheviks were based in Russian-owned industry that didn't have a labor aristocracy, where trade unions were banned and not allowed and had to exist underground. That was the base of the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks were in foreign-owned industry that had tame trade unions, and that was their base. He explains about the nature of the Bolshevik Party as not being one of monolithic subservience to a leader, but as one in which there was free debate. Again, a lot of recent research has shown that to be the case. He explained the character of the worker-peasant alliance in Russia, what made it revolutionary, with great clarity, that the situation of the peasants in Russia was quite unlike that in, say, France or Germany, where they were small landowners, small farmers. They were peasants, much more like the peasantry in Ireland, a dispossessed peasantry who had no land ownership, who were serfs, who suffered as a result of the ending of serfdom, the need to be able to buy their land, and therefore were in continual control by external moneylenders, where the situation was of in a sense, a rural proletariat in the making, and the basis of a population in the towns that came from the countryside, that you had there a natural alliance of a revolutionary peasantry that was quite different from that, say, Marx talked about in 1871 in France. And that was the basis of the worker-peasant alliance. And again, that has been validated by a whole series of academic studies that I won't bore you with now. The wars of intervention, I've already mentioned those wars of intervention. But books published over the last 10, 15, 20 years using the British archives show just how vicious and unpleasant that war was. I'm sure people here will have heard of the Black and Tans, which were, well, people, I don't need to say what the Black and Tans were, but they were the kind of war casualties of the British Army, people who had been brutalised, who were then let loose on the people of Ireland in the attempt to suppress the Irish people's struggle. What was done in Russia was far, far worse than that, because it was militarized using all the worst of the techniques that had been developed during the First World War. Aerial bombing, the use of poison gas, tank assaults. People forget just how many tanks, I think there were thousands of tanks were sent over. Thousands of aeroplanes were sent over. And the people who were being armed were fascists, almost all fascists. One book, one by Clifford Kinvig, Major General in the British Army, who used army records. He records 100,000 Jews were executed as a result of the interventions of the White Russians in the Ukraine in 1919, 1920. In total, in those 2 years, in wars that would not have taken place and couldn't have taken place without British military support, both in terms of troops and in terms of supplies and monies, something like 2 million people died. So when you ever get a right-wing polemicist saying, how many people did Stalin kill, how many people were killed in Russia? Well, you start off, how many people did the British and the French kill in Russia between 1918 and 1921? 2 million died either as a direct result of the war or as a result of starvation and disease. 2 million. And there was no excuse for it except the attempt to destroy socialism in its cradle. And that's what Andrew delineated at the time in 1920, 21, 22, 23, delineates it in that book in 1950, and which has since been entirely vindicated by scholars. And the final thing that he does is talk about the 5-year plan, and he outlines its success. Since then, academic economic historians have looked at that 5-year plan. Most notably, Robert Allen, Professor of Economic History at Oxford, From Farm to Factory, 2003. And he made a study of processes of industrialization in a whole series of countries. And he says, what happened in Russia was by far the most effective and the speediest that had taken place. And I suppose it was tested ultimately by the ability of the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. So I think I've gone on far too long, and we'll terminate more or less now. Just wanted to say 2 other things about his response, Andrew's response, aged, he would have been 93 then, the disintegration of the Soviet, or dismantling of the Soviet Union, destruction of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991. There are quite a lot of people in the Communist Party who just more or less said, well, that's finished, let's go away, it's all over. Rothstein didn't do that. And he was a historian. He had been around for almost 100 years, and he had that tradition behind him. And what did he say? quite philosophical about it? Well, there were about 5 or 6 attempts to establish capitalist societies over a 200-year period, from the first attempts in Bohemia and Germany that our comrade sitting in the audience there could probably tell us about, right back at the end of the 15th century, early 16th century, right the way through to the attempt in Holland and in the course of the 17th century, all failed in one way or another. Each taught lessons, they were learnt, until after about 200 years you did get, ultimately, the stabilization of an effective capitalist society. It will be exactly the same with socialism. It would take time, there would be failed experiments, but you had to learn from them each time. And eventually, socialism will triumph. The other thing that could be thrown at him was that he was an apologist for the Soviet Union. I don't think he was an apologist. I don't think there was anything to apologize for. There were things you would disagree with, things that Andrew very bravely did disagree with. But he had a historic task of explaining the achievements of Soviet society, the first socialist society that actually did subsist, exist, develop, grow, and show that it was possible over a 70, 80-year period that also enabled other socialist countries in Vietnam or Cuba or China to be able to develop in a way that would have been impossible any other way, and which enabled the liberation of a large part of the world's population from colonialism. He didn't apologize for that. He explained it in detail. So I would say he was not an apologist, and he was a brave person who did point out some of the failures. So that's my last slide, I think. No, it isn't the last slide, sorry. There is one last one. How would you sum up Rothstein as an educator? Patient explanation? Yes, definitely. He believed in explaining, not browbeating. Evidenced explanation? Yes, he believed in evidence. He never made claims that he couldn't prove. You could believe things if Andrew wrote them. He was not a propagandist in a vulgar sense. But most of all, he believed in learning through doing, understanding through doing, for being active. This was also a principle of Soviet education, of course. But not just doing in the abstract, doing in practice within the structures that formed class understanding. So you had to be part of a class organization that was bargaining for labor against capital. And that was why he saw it as so important that you worked within the structures of a labor movement that was organized to struggle, and if possible, organized internationally. So that does bring me to the last slide. People will be very thankful I've finally got there. I've gone on far too long. Unshakable devotion to principle. Who was that written about? It was actually written about another president of Marx Memorial Library, Morris Dobb, who died in 1976, a great Marxist theorist, great economist, probably the greatest British Marxist economist there has ever been. And that was Andrew's tribute to him. And I think it summed up what Andrew saw as important. Devotion to principle, diamond hard resolution in defending it, but exceptional personal modesty born of the desire to explain and persuade. Those are the finest qualities of a Marxist and a teacher. So that's the final words that Andrew said about Maurice Dobb. I think they can be final words we can say about Andrew himself.